Have you ever met someone who thought they had power over you? Someone so smug, so drunk on authority, that they genuinely believed you would just bow down and let them walk all over your life? Now imagine that person is running your neighborhood homeowners association, the kind of group notorious for nitpicking, bullying, and throwing around rules that make little sense. For most people, dealing with them is a nightmare. But in this story, the HOA made the biggest mistake of their lives. They picked a fight with a man who had spent decades facing down criminals, liars, and bullies far scarier than any neighborhood committee. They didn't know that the quiet gray-haired neighbor they thought they could push around was a retired sheriff, and when they tried to take his piece, he didn't just push back. He dismantled their entire operation and left them humiliated in front of the very people they once controlled. This is not just a story about revenge. It's about justice, patience, and what happens when you underestimate the wrong person. Stick with me until the end, because I promise, the payoff is one of the most satisfying you'll ever hear. When John, the retired sheriff in our story, moved into his suburban neighborhood, he wasn't looking for trouble. After 30 years in law enforcement, he was done with stress, late-night calls, and conflict. He wanted peace. His wife had passed away a few years earlier, and the house they'd shared in the countryside was too big and too lonely. So he sold it and downsized to a tidy home in a community with well-manicured lawns, quiet streets, and what seemed like friendly neighbors. He imagined morning walks, barbecues with new friends, maybe even volunteering at the local library. What he didn't imagine was that the HOA, the Homeowners Association, would make his life miserable. At first, it was small things. A letter in the mail that his lawn was a little too long, even though it looked no different than anyone else's. A note about his trash cans being visible from the street for an extra hour after pickup. He shrugged it off. Maybe they were just strict, he thought. He paid the little fines, trimmed the grass a bit more often, and kept his head down. After all, he didn't want conflict. But the more he complied, the more they pushed. One day, he received a notice that his mailbox was the wrong shade of beige, even though it matched his neighbor's exactly. Another time, they claimed the American flag he hung outside was too large for the community aesthetic, which stung, because as a veteran of public service, that flag meant everything to him. The final straw came when the HOA president, a man named Richard, showed up at John's doorstep with two other board members, arms crossed, smug grins plastered across their faces. Richard was the type who had probably peaked in high school but still acted like he was king of the world. He pointed to John's driveway and said, "You've got oil stains. That's a violation. If you don't take care of it immediately, we'll be forced to take legal action." John looked at the driveway, barely able to see what Richard was talking about. "That's not oil. That's just some discoloration in the concrete," he explained. But Richard smirked. "Doesn't matter. Rules are rules. Fix it or pay the fine. And if you think you can ignore us, think again. We can put a lien on your home. We have the power." That word, power, stuck with John. In his decades as a sheriff, he'd seen countless men like Richard, bullies who thrived on control, who enjoyed making others feel small, and usually the only way to deal with them was to stand your ground and expose them for what they really were. But John didn't lash out right then. Instead, he nodded slowly, letting Richard think he'd won. Inside, though, he was already planning his next move. Over the following weeks, the harassment continued. More letters, more fines, more visits. John started talking to his neighbors, casually asking if they'd experienced the same. What he found was shocking. Nearly everyone had a story. One woman had been fined for having potted plants on her porch that were in T-approved colors. Another man had been threatened with legal action for building a small shed in his backyard, even though the HOA had no clear rule against it. Families were scared to speak up because they didn't want retaliation. Some even whispered about missing HOA funds, higher than normal fees, and shady decisions made behind closed doors. John knew corruption when he saw it, and, unlike his neighbors, he wasn't afraid. He began attending every HOA meeting, sitting quietly in the back, taking notes. The board didn't take him seriously at first. They thought he was just an old man wasting his evenings. But John was meticulous. He requested copies of the meeting minutes, financial records, and correspondence. He filed Freedom of Information requests. He spoke to county officials, real estate agents, even past board members who had mysteriously resigned. Piece by piece, a picture began to emerge. Richard and his inner circle had been abusing their power for years. They imposed arbitrary fines to intimidate homeowners into compliance. They funneled HOA funds into suspicious maintenance projects that never seemed to materialize. They even used fear of liens to scare people into paying fines that weren't legally enforceable. As John gathered evidence, he felt something stir inside him that he hadn't felt in years: the rush of an investigation. The long nights poring over documents, the thrill of connecting dots, the satisfaction of exposing the truth. He remembered why he had become a sheriff in the first place, not just to enforce laws, but to protect people from those who would exploit them. Finally, after months of preparation, John was ready. The annual HOA meeting was approaching, the one where board elections were held and financial reports were supposed to be disclosed. Normally, these meetings were boring and sparsely attended, but this time, John made sure the room would be packed. He spent weeks quietly speaking with neighbors, showing them bits of what he'd found, encouraging them to attend. By the time the night came, the community center was overflowing. Richard and his board strutted in, clearly unprepared for what was about to happen. Richard began the meeting with his usual pompous tone, rattling off fines collected and vague, upcoming projects. But when it came time for questions, John stood up, holding a thick binder in his hand. His voice was calm, steady, but carried the weight of authority that only years of command could bring. "I've been reviewing the HOA's records," John began, "and I have some concerns." He started small, pointing out discrepancies in the budget. Missing funds here, unexplained expenses there. Richard tried to brush it off, but John kept pressing. He opened the binder, showing copies of checks made out to companies that didn't exist, payments for services never rendered, fines that were collected illegally. He had dates, names, signatures. With each revelation, murmurs grew louder in the room. Neighbors exchanged shocked glances, some even pulling out their phones to record. Richard's face turned red. He stammered, tried to interrupt, but John didn't let him. "I spent 30 years as a sheriff," John said firmly. "I know corruption when I see it, and what you have been running here isn't a community association. It is a scam." The room erupted. People shouted their frustrations, demanding answers. The board members looked cornered, like rats in a trap. And, for once, Richard's smug grin was gone. By the end of the night, the homeowners voted to remove the entire board. New elections were held on the spot, and for the first time in years, the HOA had leaders who actually cared about the community. But it didn't end there. With John's evidence, county officials launched an investigation. Several board members faced legal consequences, and Richard himself was forced to step down in disgrace. The man who once boasted about his power over others now had none. As for John, he didn't run for the board. He didn't need the title. He had already achieved what he wanted: peace for himself and justice for his neighbors. From that day on, people looked at him with respect, not just as the retired sheriff next door, but as the man who finally stood up to the bullies and won. And in a quiet moment afterward, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, John reflected on it all. He hadn't sought revenge. He hadn't wanted conflict. But sometimes life puts you in the path of people who abuse their power. And when that happens, you have a choice. You can back down, or you can fight. And when you fight with truth, patience, and courage, justice has a way of finding its mark. So the next time you hear about an HOA horror story, remember this one. Remember that power doesn't always sit with the loudest voice or the highest title. Sometimes it sits quietly with the person everyone underestimates until the moment they decide enough is enough. And in this case, the HOA learned that lesson the hard way. And if you've ever dreamed of watching bullies get exactly what they deserve, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more stories like this, and share in the comments what's the worst HOA or community rule you've ever heard of. Because maybe, just maybe, there's another John out there right now, quietly building his case, ready to turn the tables.